currently here in the Energy Efficient Cities Initiative, which is affiliated with CSIC. And I am going to follow up this talk by being one of those experiments in a way, not at all part of Organicity, but actually trying to grow food. So we look at how we can monitor the performance of an underground hydroponic farm. So I'll just start a bit further out just to tell you why it's interesting to be in an underground hydroponic farm in London. So, what's going to work? There we go. So, as we know, we are going to have 2.6 billion extra people in cities by 2050. So as populations are going to become increasingly urban, especially in the developing world, but everywhere, population in cities is changing, but at the same time, all of our arable land is already used. And not only is it already used, but we are having increased strain on arable land because of decreasing soil fertility, land erosion, eutrophication of rivers. I tried to represent them in a little diagram, apologies for the drawing. On top of the fact that we're having less land, we're also transporting all our food from rural areas towards cities. So urban farming isn't the only solution to food security, but it's a thing that people are starting to look at more and more. So I'll just press play. Sorry. So there's about 100 million people already in the world taking part in urban farming, especially in the developing world where people just really use it as a source of food. So here. I think you haven't clicked on the slide. So, fortunately, not having luck. So anyways, normally you would see a picture of various urban farms across the world, and the one up here would be a farm in Nepal. So in India, I went traveling, and you notice that most of the houses are built on with extra floor space for whenever they need to build the next floor, and lots of people just transform those fabrics into I thought you'd see it, into little allotments. But at the same time, for example, the urban farming capital of the Western world is Detroit, where a lot of abandoned places have been developed into big communal gardens. And in the West, urban farming also has a cultural, recreational perspective to it as well. But basically the point is it's already a lot done. However, what I'm trying to capture here is the trend as well towards plant factories and controlled environment greenhouses. So already all of our tomatoes that we probably eat, they're not labeled organic, they're grown hydroponically. So this is just large-scale hydroponic examples. So in Japan, you have things called plant factories. There was 9 in 2009, and now there's over 170 in Japan, where they just grow here 3,000 lettuces a day with 50 workers. And up here, you've got about, 140 tons of salad a year produced on a rooftop of a supermarket in the US, in a place called Gotham Greens. Well, the company's called Gotham Greens, it's in Chicago. So here I'm going to talk about an example in London. So the only hydroponic farm in London is called Growing Underground. There was another one, it has gone bust. So they're the only ones now. And so they are there's not much space in London compared to America, where they have huge supermarkets where they can cover that rooftop into a greenhouse. So here they're using derelict World War II air raid shelters built in the 1940s, not used since the 60s. And they're 33 meters below ground, and they're trying to make this productive hydroponic farm. It's going well, and they're going to expand 7 times the size. So I'll talk to you a bit about how we've been monitoring this site for the last 3 years to improve the energy use efficiency, how much they can grow, knowing that there used to be an air raid shelter, and it was designed to be an air raid shelter in the first place. It's a startup, so they are continuously changing throughout the time that we were working with them, how they were managing it, and so how can we feed back information from data to improve the performance while they're still continuously running. So you're constantly changing what you're observing as you're trying to feed back the impact of what you're seeing. And also they grow microgreens. The time of those crops is 7 to 10 days max. So things go in and out really quickly. So I'll talk a bit about the monitoring network that we set up. How do you even set up a monitoring network in a tunnel in a farm? How we've used this data to optimize the farm, and how through this interpretation we are now going to develop a forecasting tool to help continuously the farm. So the monitoring network, I'll summarize a bit first what we're sensing, why we're sensing it, and what were the three main things we were trying to achieve through sensing to make sure we were continuously not losing our track of what we were doing. The difference between continuous data logging, when we can continuously log in some information, but also, because it's a farm, there's also a lot that we need to manually log. So the three main things to collect were farm controls, what was impacting the energy use of the farm. So were the doors open, closed, the lights, the energy use, the fans that are turning the air around, the environmental conditions of air velocity, humidity, temperature, CO2, and light, as well as the harvest conditions. So where were the crops growing, which crops were growing, how healthy were they, and how much of the farm was occupied in the first place. So what we were trying to figure out was optimize energy use. So the two main sources of energy, of use of energy, were the lights and the fans. So here you can see that the lights basically are the only source of heating of the farm. So it's underground, so they need artificial lighting, but they don't need any heating at all. Obviously, we're trying to optimize our environment so that everything stays within the bounds they need to be for growing food, and at the same time, grow as much crops as possible in as little time as possible. So we developed a wireless monitoring network, which has changed over the time. So probably like the sensors where they are right now isn't where they are, right? But the big difficulty is there's as you're saying, there's like innate problems with having sensors. Initially, we had sensors that needed plugs, so you had to make sure you were logging. You were logging where there was a power socket, not necessarily where it was optimal to log. So also it was the wireless network. So it's a tunnel, it's below ground, and there's huge amounts of metal which are stopping the signal from going from one place to the next. So we created a wireless mesh of sensors. So the sensors would like send data from one sensor to the next in hops. They wouldn't have to have access to wireless, but they could have access to each other. But whenever you move anything, sometimes they lose access. So we had to develop a network where the sensors would be close enough to be able to send data to each other, but also save data on the sensors themselves and only upload the data whenever they have access to the internet, so we don't lose any information. So this was very much of a trial and error. So at the same time, we had lots of temperature sensors along the tunnel, on every shelf, everywhere, to make sure that, and these are not wireless, so to make sure we don't lose data all the time, we just have some that we have to go in and pick up. This is kind of what it looks like. So obviously another one of the issues with just working in a farm is if someone pulls the tray and you didn't put the sensor back correctly, then that sensor's moved, and you have to take that into account when you analyze your data. So then, because most sensors aren't designed for underground hydroponic greenhouses, we decided to build our own. So we did the best we could to make it battery powered, save the data on a SD card, have 3 light sensors that at least one of them would give us data that we want, and even more temperature humidity sensors. So then we can put them across, and then these do send data wirelessly continuously to us. And then the other piece of data that we collect, obviously, is manual data collection. So here you can see, for example, this is Greg, who goes in and checks which crops are growing where, because it's difficult to. So we tried cameras, but again, because of the power connection, etc., it wasn't so easy. So people just go and say this is where the crops are going to be. So we have a location of every crop. At the same time, crops are cut and weighed and then put into a spreadsheet manually, which means that we have then this data, which is manually collected, so it has different sources of error. But so we know which type of crops have been harvested, how much, how long they took to grow, how much was wasted, more or less accurately. And another issue is that no matter how much sensors you've got, how many columns you have in your spreadsheet of data recording, there's going to be some unexpected things. So we also have space for farm comments where things like moving fans, lots of things died, so we moved this to the other end. This is also, we input that into our model. So this is how we try to learn from this data to feed back to growing underground to improve their performance. So it's a lot of data, but what we try to do is to derive what would be the performance indicators that we need in the end when we put everything together to tell growing underground how to optimize their energy use and grow as much as possible. So we derived from crop growth compared to environmental conditions, the optimal conditions for growing underground compared to typical. So because it's underground and we've got 2 phases, the night phase and the day phase, because it's lit artificially, so the lights have a huge impact on temperatures. So we do have to separate our optimal conditions for night and day. our relative humidity has to be lower in growing underground because it's just got less potential for ventilation, and the structural health of the tunnels does depend on having too much humidity. But also, because it's so dependent on a one-directional ventilation system, second gets too humid, it gets very mouldy, and then you have to throw away all the crops. And then I can go on to all the specific. We need a certain air velocity in the middle of the tunnel so that we can assume that we have good air velocities around on the trays, because plants need a certain air current speed over the plants themselves in order to be able to take in all the CO2 present in the air. If there's not enough air, but you have enough CO2, there's not enough air going over it, it won't take that CO2. So some things we've learned through this data was that crops obviously grow differently in different locations. So we figured out where they were growing better and worse. So for example, I'll pick wasabi mustard on this drawing, which is the yellow one. Yeah. So you can see that at the front of the farm, the yield compared to average was lower than usual, and it was better towards the back. Yet in pink, you can see that they were growing about everywhere. Really, they were growing better in the back. And the same was for salad roquette, where they weren't growing so well. So the little green was in the front, and they were growing much better in the back of the farm. And then they were growing them mostly in the front in the beginning, just because that's at the end of the farm, they just put them there. And so then they could inform their decisions the following year, where you can see salad roquette, they grow a lot more often at the back of the farm, and they also grow the wasabi mustard completely different tunnel now. And as a result, their yields just in general increased because they were locating where they were growing better. And the main reason for that, and this is now that we have made all these changes. It used to be every along the tunnel, you'd have different temperatures. At the top, obviously hot air rises, so you'd have very big differences between the top and the bottom. But now they've increased their ventilation systems, etc., with perforated sulks. We've tried everything you can. So now we actually have very little stratification from, as you enter the farm, so from the 12th column onwards towards the back of the farm, you tend to have very similar temperature conditions all along the farm, whether you're at the top shelf or the bottom shelf, even though it does obviously tend to get a bit warm at the top shelf. But you still have quite significant changes in conditions at the front of the farm, because that's where the doors are and that's where the air flows in. And so as a result, you need to put the hardier crops at the front. And also for us it's interesting whenever things go badly, because we can learn from that. Another thing was air velocities. There's so much going on in that farm that airflow is just not continuous. We took measurements, they're never the same along a cross section, they're never the same all along the tunnel, they're never the same on a single day. So we just had to be able to aggregate air velocity data to be able to figure out whether or not they have the correct air velocity data. So one of the main things we thought when we started working with growing underground was, actually this is a great location for a farm because you're not going to have to heat it, which they don't have to heat because they've got the lights, but they need the energy for the lights. But also temperatures underground are very stable. So you can see here the outdoor temperatures for the last 3 years, and the temperatures of going underground, obviously have a variation, but they still remain quite constant throughout the year. And what we were interested in is how much does this seasonal variation actually impact how well the crops are growing. Obviously, you can't just say what happened in the year. In summer, they tend to grow slower. In winter, they tend to grow faster, because every time something was going badly in 2017, we told them, and then they changed it for 2018, so that thing's not happening anymore. So then you're seeing something else through the data. But on average, in green, you've got crops that grow longer than average, so less long. It means that they had a lower yield than expected. And the beets from the east, they tend to take way longer to grow and grew less than average, and then it's just evened out. And basically, what they did there lights patterns that they had and ventilation patterns, so that we could try and optimize our crop growth. Another thing that we do is try and predict how well the crops are going to grow over the year, over the week of the year. So because this farm is only productive, is only worth it if you can grow as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So you need to be able to fill the farm as much as possible all the time. But because of how orders come in, you need to have an estimate of how much you can grow to know how much you can sell, so that you can then make sure that you're selling what you're producing. So we created some sort of trends for every single crop for every single year to show that they're not always the same. It depends on the conditions themselves. But so this is the week of the year over different years, and this is pea shoots. So this is one of the things we derive performance metrics. So there's no point in just knowing the yield of a crop. We want to know how well it happens. So here we want to know how long it spends in the farm in the first place. And pea shoots tend to perform, or obviously when the conditions were better than in the first year that they operated, much better in growth and produce more food. Thank you. And so as a result, they can start shortening the days that the pea shoots are in, and then even changing their production plan. However, that's not the case with Advocate. So you can't just make an assumption about, you can't just look at the data aggregated, you have to disaggregate the data. Finally, I just wanted to go through the fact that people often ask how productive really is this farm and how does it compare. 95% of the energy use of the farm is for the lights and the ventilation system. It's very power hungry. It uses 725 kilowatt hours per meter squared, which is about over what greenhouses typically use per meter squared. But it grows about 10 to 15 times more per hectare than typically for lettuce grown on the field or in a greenhouse. You can grow so much more per. So I didn't find any data for kilowatt hours per kilo per hectare, but I found data for kilowatt hours per meter squared and tons per meter squared. And so it depends what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to have a lot of food locally, then it's good. If you're trying to not use any energy at all, then it's bad. Do look at the overlap between ventilation use and, for example, here, outdoor conditions were dropping and the temperatures in the farm were dropping. Yet they maintained their extraction fan, the power of the extraction fan to the same level. So what we want to do is be able to predict when temperatures are going to and double check that with how much energy they're using and disaggregate that energy into what is it being used for, so then we can different possibilities of extraction fan power. This is just a slide showing that through this they have managed to improve their conditions quite a lot. So they used to have big humidity problems, and we want them to be more or less blue or green, and now over the years they have really good humidity levels, but they change around the year. So finally, so this is what I was talking about forecasting models. So through all the data analysis, we've now derived what performance indicators we want to be continuously feedbacking to growing underground. And so now we're developing a forecasting model depending on external and internal temperatures, which can then be fed back to correlated with the energy use, so we can predict and give suggestions on how to reduce energy use while maintaining their crop growth, which is what this final diagram represents, the feedback going on within growing underground. So the external conditions affect the environmental conditions and how much energy use they use. By working better between our sensors and our model, we can improve the energy use for the fan and lighting and make sure that they always have the correct bounds for optimizing crop growth.